Ivey for 5 minutes for questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Gaines, this is a topic, it's a little off topic for the hearing, I think, but wasn't the Stanford official who made those comments removed from her position?
This was at the San Francisco State University, so I'm not entirely sure about Stanford, but she was not removed. Her name is Dr. Jamila Moore, and she's the Vice President of Student Affairs.
Right, but the praising of these kinds of activities on college campuses, do you know about some of the steps other universities have taken to try and address this?
I'm just here to talk about what happened at San Francisco State University.
Fair enough, fair enough. Let me ask this. Let me read this piece here. Just over 27 years ago, the prominent white supremacist Louis Beam Jr. published a now infamous essay titled Leaderless Resistance. Extremist organizations, Beam argued, were too vulnerable to government disruption. The future of white supremacy was individual. Lone actors and small self-organized groups that could take action at their own initiative was the way to go. Mr. Rosas, let me ask you if you're familiar with this lone actor approach that's been taken by some of the right-wing extremists, especially the ones who are committing massive attacks that are killing multiple people. Have you seen any of those activities?
Well, on the news, yes.
Okay, have you researched or studied any of those activities?
Well, which one specifically? Like, are we talking about El Paso, Buffalo, or?
Pick one. I mean, unfortunately, there's dozens of these, and
Yeah.
yes, take Charlottesville. I mean, what?
Yeah, I was there covering it. I was there.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm acutely aware of what happened there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you find that troubling and disturbing?
Of course. I also found it troubling that a big reason for the violence was how ill-prepared local law enforcement was. They were not separating the two sides. I walked through the crowd, and I found myself in between the two sides fighting, and there were state police on the other side of the road.
All right, so you're blaming the police you're not blaming the police for the killing of Ms.
I'm
Hyde.
blaming the poor planning. Because when there's big events like that, you want to make sure that no vehicles are able to drive in those areas to prevent exactly what happened later on in that afternoon. So there was multiple failures, just like January 6th, there was multiple failures to adequately prepare.
I'll come back to January 6th, but the killing of Ms. Hyde, you agree with the neo-Nazi Mr. Fields who drove the car and hit her with that, right?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
The neo-Nazi who drove the car that killed Ms. Hyde, you'll agree, was responsible for her death.
Oh, directly, absolutely, yeah.
Right, and he was convicted, I think he pled guilty to two different sets of charges, has a double life sentence he's serving. You agree with that?
Yeah.
All right, and then there was a civil suit. Actually, you might be connected to that, Ms. Spitanik, in which leaders of the organization, which helped to support this Unite the Right rally, were held to be liable, and there were damages imposed. I don't remember the amount, but you understand that happened as well, right?
Yes.
Okay, and there were civil rights violations that were connected with those activities, right?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay, and with respect to January 6th, I guess I'll come to you, Mr. Erickson. You mentioned that Portland was disgraceful and should never happen again. And I certainly agree with that position. Would you agree that January 6th was disgraceful and should never happen again?
Yes, I would.
Okay. And one of the things I wanted to ask you with respect to the solutions, you talked a little bit about some of the activities, but this committee's had a hearing with respect to, one of the issues we could have considered at that hearing was countering false information, disinformation that pushes these kinds of ideologies forward. When you were at Homeland Security, did you pursue any of those activities, or do you think that would be useful in some of these scenarios to try and address whether you think it's right or left-wing violence, that we should try and address it in those ways?
I don't think it's the government's place to necessarily be in the business of deciding what is or is not appropriate speech. I think that, obviously there's plenty of misinformation and disinformation floating around on the internet. I think people have to be mature consumers of that information.
Let me give you an example. It's a little off topic for this, but false allegations about active shooters at elementary schools and communities. We now have a scenario where people, rather than pulling the fire alarm for whatever reason, now are making calls saying there's an active shooter at elementary school X, even though there isn't one. Would you agree that that's something that the government should take steps to respond to and denounce so that parents don't go crazy, police don't go down with weapons drawn and accidentally shoot somebody, teachers don't freak out? Do you think that would be appropriate to address that kind of misinformation?
Of course.
Okay. My time has expired. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Thank you. And I